Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Health Collective Talks. I'm Amrita Tripathi, a former journalist and the founder editor of the Health Collective, where we've been collecting stories mainly of lived experience, looking at mental health and mental illness from an India lens. We also take the opportunity to talk to experts across the field to look at how some of these intersections play out in our day-to-day life. And I'm delighted to bring on today two wonderful speakers and guests to talk about something that is really buzzing, something many of us need to know more about, and that topic is climate change. I'm going to introduce Anu Jogesh, my friend and wonderful former colleague, who's a climate adaptation practitioner and a doctoral researcher at the LSE, at the Department of Geography and Environment. Thanks so much for joining us, Anu. And I'm just going to give a few more lines in terms of the introduction. Anu's research sitting at the intersection of domestic finance, community vulnerability, and climate adaptation in South Asia. Anu is also a very well-known former journalist. She was a Chevening Scholar and a fellow of the US Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Amrita. That was long.
That was a trifle long. And bringing in Dr. Karan Thakur as well with an equally impressive introduction. Firstly, Karan, thank you so much for joining us. Friends of the Health Collective know Karan from his videos, from his articles, and it's really been a privilege and a delight to work with you all these years on a subject we're so passionate about. In this avatar, Karan is joining us as the Group Lead Sustainability and ESG. He's the Vice President Public Affairs at the Apollo Hospitals Group in New Delhi. Karan is also an Eisenhower Fellowships Global Fellow 2022. And I just discovered he's part of the G20 Climate Change and Health Track being organized by ADB, UNEP, and G20. So thank you so much for joining us, Karan, and taking out the time.
Thanks, Amrita. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by unpacking a little bit of something we've been hearing a lot more of in the recent past, which is climate anxiety. We know now that there's a strong connection really between climate change and mental health. And of course, both of you will have been seeing this for quite a while and reading about it. I think it's really picking up now in the mainstream in terms of conversations. We certainly know during the pandemic, we saw a lot more younger people talking about actual anxiety and climate anxiety, and it's not hyperbole to talk about. Can you take us through a little bit about what that actually means? Karan, I can start with you, and then Anu, talk us through a little bit about what climate anxiety actually means in a sort of real world case scenario.
Yeah, so Amrita, thanks for discussing this subject. I think it's becoming more and more important. When we talk about climate change, and climate change and health specifically, usually you would think of a lot of things that it could mean to you. I mean, it could mean heat waves, air pollution, etc. But we don't often discuss how this impacts our mental health. And we do know that there are a lot of external determinants which impact our mental health and well-being. And climate change, being the subject that it is, given the impact that it has in every aspect of our life, is going to cause mental health issues, which include anxiety, but could also mean just worry about the future generations, and so on and so forth. So these two subjects, the intersections, are something that are very important and are going to become equally important as we progress in this journey of how do we want to tackle climate change. This is not an issue just of the young. We are seeing climate anxiety, which means being anxious or worried about the future of the planet, of our loved ones, about our own health, and how we're going to see through this challenge is across all ages. And one primary driver for this is all the information and news that is making its way, rightly so, on our screens, on our cell phones, etc., but also a lack of agency. People feel that they are not empowered enough to really tackle this crisis, unlike, say, a health crisis or any other issue that you may be facing, whether it's a job loss or a loss of a loved one, etc. So those are the gamut of issues at play when we talk about climate change and anxiety.
Sure. Thanks so much, Karan. And Anu, can you add to that and sort of layering this, as a layperson, we first heard about it in the context of young people. We heard about it in the context of as Karan is saying, it's not just young people. Climate change, anxiety, and the mental health impact is something that impacts across the spectrum. Why are we seeing more of this? If you can layer it to that context as well.
Absolutely. I think first to start off with, when you think about climate anxiety, there are multiple scales at which you see it, right? There's the global climate linked anxiety, which is what's the future? What does it hold? What's it going to look like? What are our lifestyles going to be? What's the biodiversity going to be like? What are cities going to be like? So there is the very much the future and what that means. But then there's the here and the now, right? That often is more weather and broader environment related and things that are immediately palpable. Now, if you add a layer to that, there's also differential privilege. Who are the people who are despairing about the future? Who are the ones who are young and thinking about what that future holds for them? But then also, who are the socioeconomically vulnerable who don't likely have the luxury of despair, but are actually facing it as well? So there's trauma there. There is very much sort of post-traumatic symptoms that you would have, where you're seeing, say, in a city where floods have become a regular feature and there is displacement linked to floods. So, very different layers in all of this. I think the most important thing to also think about when you think about climate-related anxiety is that it doesn't sit in isolation, like with everything linked to climate change, right? It is very much an exacerbation of all other things that are likely causing stress and anxiety in our society today, whether it is increasing or rising inequality, whether it's geopolitical tensions, whether it's inflation, whether it's crop loss, whether it's indebtedness. There's the pandemic, there's displacement and migration linked to all of these and more, right? There's a loss of community. There's loss of state interventions in social infrastructure. There's so much to unpack there. And climate really sits on top of that. Now, if you add biophysical risk to what you're seeing your own green cover in your city degrade, you're seeing groundwater loss, you're hit by floods more often, you're seeing, deteriorating air quality. All of these then sort of get linked up into things you think about that are affecting you now or likely to affect you in the future. And I completely agree. I think you're seeing much more of this amongst the youth because there is community and activism that's driving some of this. And it's giving them some level of agency as well.
Okay, Anu, I just want to ask you a little bit more. Personally, both you and Karan, as parents, it must hit differently. When you think about climate anxiety, when you think about the legacy, what the next generation has actually just been saddled with, how do you cope? What are some of the things that are helping you deal with this?
Right. I mean, I can tell you my personal experience. My son was still young some years ago. So really not in a space where he was comprehending what it means for the future. But I very quickly noticed that he was mirroring my anxiety. And this was a very sort of hyper-local anxiety. We've had increased wind speeds. I don't know if you've noticed in Delhi every time it rains. Erratic, short rainfall, high wind speeds, lots of trees falling, right? And we had this beautiful tree in my neighborhood. It faced my balcony. It was the thing I loved. Green spaces are hard to find, right, in big metropolises, and this was important for us. And every time we had monsoon, and the monsoon is a time to celebrate, right? In India, it's a joyous thing. But every time we'd had these winds and the rain, I would panic, and I would see my son panicking as well. He was just basically mirroring my anxiety. And now, of course, as he's getting older, there are these questions about, what's the world going to look like when I'm 50? So, so these are real questions. I think it's a hard one. It's hard to talk about this. I use my expert hat often, and I quote Rebecca Solnit in saying, that despair is sometimes a luxury of the privileged. The people who really face the here and now just need to get on with it. They cope. But also importantly, to talk about the fact that we're seeing the future play out based on what socioeconomic pathways are going to be, right? What is that sort of carbon intensive future we're envisioning? And are there ways for us to work to make sure that that's not the future we see? right? And so talking about how likely there is some agency, not necessarily individual, but community agency to hold institutions and governments to account in trying and steering what our future will be. Yeah, so I am preaching a bit of activism, but that's the only way you can quell these fears for children.